Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. With the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate. Salamu alaikum, peace and blessings be with you all. Welcome back to this final session in the Cambridge Muslim College's Ramadan program entitled Arts, Culture, and History, Lessons from Our Islamic Heritage. In this series, we've been reflecting upon our present by exploring the varied and dynamic cultural, artistic, and intellectual spaces of Islamic history. Last week, with Canadian singer, artist, and poet Dawood Wharnsby, we explored how the vast world of poetry, song, and music in Islamic cultures has been a means of joining and enlivening hearts. Dawood reminded us that, like the simple clay drum, we too are vessels of clay, ready to receive with our senses. Tonight, we explore the sensory experience par excellence in Islamic history, namely that most enchanting and beautiful abode of the Islamic garden. Throughout history, wherever Muslims have found themselves in the world, wondrous gardens followed. And as we'll discover tonight, the Islamic garden is a window into how Muslims envisaged and created contemplative spaces in which to remember their creator. Here to guide us in our journey of Islamic gardens this evening is garden designer and lecturer Emma Clark. Emma designs gardens with a fundamentally spiritual and holistic outlook, undertaking them for private clients and public institutions, both in the UK and abroad. She specializes mainly in Islamic gardens, focusing on contemporary interpretations of traditional principles with naturalistic planting schemes and sustainability at the heart of her practice. Emma is senior tutor and lecturer on the postgraduate Visual Islamic and Traditional Arts program at the Prince's School of Traditional Arts. She has published 2 books in this area, The Art of the Islamic Garden and Underneath Which Rivers Flow. And recently, Emma also designed the beautiful garden of the famed Cambridge Central Mosque, which opened last year. Emma, we are so grateful that you could talk to us today about Islamic gardens.
Thank you very much. Introduction. Thank you so much. You're obviously an expert on Islamic gardens yourself, Amina. But this is a great honor to be invited to be on this series of events, which you've run so professionally. So thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Emma. So I think we can probably start with right the beginning question that I think so many of us will be wondering at this stage, which is, what actually is an Islamic garden and what are the features of an Islamic garden?
Well, what is an Islamic garden? It is a question that's often asked of me. I mean, number one, the supreme element, the supreme feature is water, of course, and this is closely followed by shade. And of course, one cannot have shade without water. But before I go into those sort of actual elements of the garden on earth, as it were, I usually start by saying that the Islamic garden is a kind of divine meeting place between 4 factors, 3 horizontal earthly factors, if you like, and 1 vertical transcendent one. And one of them is, it's the idea of paradise being a garden is not Islamic, of course. I mean, it is Islamic in that we embrace it as Muslims, as do Christians and Jews from the Bible, but it's very ancient. It goes back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is one of the oldest, if not the oldest writings known to man. And in this epic, this is I think 4000 BC, he talks about paradise having a fount and shade in it. So that's one, this is one aspect, this sort of very ancient aspect, which has been renewed, as it were. Then there's the idea of, well, the oasis garden. Of course, Islam was born in the desert, and therefore, any water was seen as sacred. And so water and the palm tree are, again, the oasis garden is also feeds into this idea of paradise and greenery. And the other is the fourfold form, which, again, on earth, is the 4 directions of space. So it's completely rooted in the cosmos, if you like. It's rooted in earth, and in Iran, they took this to new heights. Again, you know, ancient, really sort of 2000 BC and earlier. Their gardens and their hunting parks had these 4-fold design, which is completely from the practical point of view, of course, it works best because you want to water as much area as possible with minimum amount of water. So you would go in 4 different directions. So these are the sort of 3, what I called horizontal earthly features. And of course, the key in Islam is the Quran, of course. And this is in Surah Al-Rahman mainly, we have the descriptions of the 4 gardens or 2 pairs of gardens. I mean, there are about 130 references to the gardens of paradise throughout the Quran, but Surah Al-Rahman, chapter 55, is the one where they're described most in the greatest detail, if you like. 2 pairs of gardens. There's the lower and the higher pair. And this, of course, is to do with the symbolism, very profound symbolism related to these, which we probably won't go into a great deal here. I mean, I'll now go back to the earthly elements. So if you're making an Islamic garden on earth and you want to capture something of the Jannat al-Firdaus, this is the gardens of paradise. Jannat tajri min tahtiha al-anhar, gardens underneath which rivers flow. This is the phrase which is most often repeated. So this idea of water flowing underneath, it's a very beautiful idea, and I would say it hasn't been captured that many times in gardens across the Islamic world. I mean, I think the time I most experienced it was in Iran, in fact, where at the foot of the mountains above Tehran, you can go walking in the woods there, and this wonderful clear rushing water comes down from the melted snow. And then in the cafes, I don't know if you've been, Amina, they put these sort of iron bedsteads with a carpet on top, and they straddle the streams. So you're sitting on the carpet, on this not particularly comfortable bed, but it doesn't matter. And you've got water flowing underneath, and you're sitting and you're being brought a delicious food and tea, and you can lie down, maybe a shisha if you're so inclined, and look up through the trees, quite often the oriental plane tree, Platanus orientalis, and then and you see the blue sky, and it's a taste of paradise. There's no question. So they capture it there beautifully.
So Emma, water and shade in this Iranian garden seem to have come to the fore with great visual clarity. What are the other features of an Islamic garden aside from water and shade?
Well, one of them is enclosure, this idea of enclosure. I think Jannah means sort of hidden and secret as well as garden. And it arises from practical reasons, because if you're in the desert, you want to sort of delineate your interior space, which is going to be nurtured by water and shade, and you want to grow some beautiful lush planting. It's such a contrast to the heat and the dryness without. So this idea of enclosure is to keep that out, and then to keep the beautiful abundancy of greenery and flowing water within. And of course, this has a beautiful symbolism as well. It's about the interior, our own interior garden. We all have our own interior garden, which needs to be nurtured. And, the outside garden needs to be nurtured with our tending it, paying it due respect and tender, loving care, and pruning it, for example, and weeding it. And at the same time, you could say that our interior garden needs a little bit of pruning and feeding, nurturing. So the outside garden needs nurturing with water and with compost. We can be very literal here. And the interior garden needs to be nurtured by the remembrance of God. And this is how we, in this pandemic in particular, both the exterior garden and the interior garden are becoming more and more important. They're crucial for our sanity, in fact, just our sanity, as well as being a beautiful and calm place to go. So enclosure is about really keeping the world, as it were, outside, and then a sort of stillness and calm within. And I think at the Cambridge Mosque Garden, there's a very small, what's called a community garden, which is adjoining the pavement. There's a bus stop right in front of the mosque, which has a lovely view, because you can sit waiting for your bus, and then you look directly through into the gardens of the mosque. And the idea really was to have a quiet space to calm yourself from, your daily commute or whatever before you go in to pray.
So in addition to the
Yes.
enclosure, you said water and shade, enclosure, and the two others.
Plenty more. Well, in fact, talking about the mosque, it's this relationship with architecture. I've noticed that the relationship with architecture in Islamic gardens is probably greater than almost any other gardening tradition. I'm sure somebody might argue with me here, but there is, I think, it's because of the heat. Mostly the Islamic world is in countries which are hot, and therefore shade is extremely important. So if you look at Iranian gardens like the Baghi Fin, or I'm trying to think, around Isfahan, the Shalimar Gardens in Pakistan, Lahore. I mean, even the Taj Mahal, you have this relationship with the building, and the building might be, in the case of the Taj Mahal, of course, it's a mausoleum, and the mausoleum gardens are usually either the mausoleum itself is usually at the center of the garden, although the Taj Mahal, of course, it has this exception that it's at the head of the garden, and on the other side is the river. And there's no question that this relationship with the Chahar Bagh, the fourfold, we talked about the four gardens at the beginning, because they come from the four directions of space. So the Chahar Bagh, which is it's a sort of a crucial, it's not an element so much, it's a type of garden. And I would say that it's the most well-known of the Islamic gardens. I mean, Chahar means four in Persian, in Farsi, and Bagh means garden. So I think the Iranians would say this is a good reason for saying that actually the origin of is from Iran. But Chahar Bagh is four gardens, and I often talk about creating a Chahar Bagh, which is a reflection of the four gardens, the two pairs of gardens, which are described in Surah Al-Rahman. So I think when it comes to making an Islamic garden today, especially an enclosed one, I mean, the idea of enclosure is very prominent in traditional Islamic cities, for example, in Fez, or I mean, even in the older areas of Marrakesh, the traditional architecture is around an enclosed space, partly because of the climate, of course, and this is a way of being cool, and it's a way of enclosing the garden within. But also, interestingly, it's a huge parallel with medieval gardens here in this country. I'm in England. And in Cambridge, of course, and Oxford and Cambridge, you've got the great quadrangles. So these are, in a sense, a kind of Chahar Bagh, like the cloister gardens of the great cathedrals, like Salisbury or Westminster Abbey. So you've got this four surrounding the inner garden, which quite often has a fountain. I mean, in the Islamic garden, it would ideally always have a fountain, because again, the descriptions in Surah Al-Rahman talk about each of the four gardens having a fountain. It also talks about the four rivers, of course, flowing from the center, and the four rivers of paradise, which are in Islam the river of water, milk, honey, and wine. These are all highly symbolic, and probably relate to the purity of the soul, and they relate to the closeness to the divine. I mean, this is why in Surah Al-Rahman it talks about the two lower gardens, and then the two higher gardens are for the souls who are closest to our Lord. And this is measured by the purity of your soul, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
So water, shade, to sum up what I've said already, enclosure, relationship with architecture, and the Chahar Bagh, really. These are all key elements of the Islamic garden on earth.
So this raises so many interesting things about the relationship between, you've touched on it already, the relationship between the garden and Islamic spirituality. It seems like there's a very firm connection here. Can you maybe talk a little bit about why gardens have been so important in Islamic spirituality?
Well, I think this idea of them being paradise, and actually I talked for rivers. I mean, interesting, this goes back to the Bible, and in Genesis, it says that, from the, talks about the four rivers coming from a fountain. It's very, I wanted to emphasize that it's not just Islamic, that it's not completely universal, but it's certainly true to the three Abrahamic religions. But it's a whole new level. And I think, and the idea of green in the descriptions of the gardens in the Quran, green is such an important color. And I mean, I was reading somebody once who said, imagine if, I'm looking now towards my own tiny little garden, a lot of green. Green is more important than color, really. I mean, I would say that if you're creating an Islamic garden, water, green, shade are all essential. Although color, different hues are mentioned over and over again in the Quran, I think it's these other elements which come first. And also scent is another element which comes first. Comes as well. But the spirituality in the garden, I think it's completely key, and it just goes back to where do we come from and where are we going? We come from God, and unto God do we return. It's a garden that we came from. The Garden of Eden is the garden of paradise, and we come as pure, innocent human beings. There is the fall, and our whole journey is to sort of regain that paradisal garden. And that's and so everything in the garden it's a taste of paradise, if you like, but it's a reflection of the paradise. And I think, we all love gardens for so many different reasons. And there's so many different layers of understanding. And I think the more you work in a garden, I mean, we've all heard an awful lot about how healing it is to be in a garden. And healing, and the birdsong. People have talked about birdsong so much recently because there have been no aeroplanes. It's completely wonderful. Paradisal in themselves, and speaking the language of the gods. And water, you see, is a symbol of the soul. So that's another thing. From all my experience of traveling around the Islamic world and looking at the Islamic gardens, they use water in a way which is much more varied than any other gardening tradition. Again, I think people who love Italian gardens would probably argue, but there's the stillness, and there's the running water, and there's the way, in Iran, they carve these beautiful stone chadors. Chador means a shawl. So it's a shawl of water, and it's carved so that when the water falls over, the light falls upon the water, and they get this wonderful sort of sparkling, diamond effect. It sounds a bit cheesy, but actually it is very, very beautiful. And it is a reflection of the soul. I always ask the question, why is water so important in a garden, even wherever you are in the world, even if it's in somewhere cold? Because when you walk around a garden, and there are many, many beautiful gardens to visit in Great Britain, in the United Kingdom, you kind of hear water. There's this lovely sound, and you are drawn, and you want to sit by it. It's always at the end where you want to sit, because there is this idea of being at home. After all, we're 7 water or something. So we feel obviously we're not fish, but you know, there is a sense of feeling at home and of feeling at peace. And again, you know, with this pandemic, we're allowed out once a day in the UK, and I often go to the river. It's not very far. I can bicycle to the river. It's rather crowded, but the few friends that I've seen, that when you're by water, there is a sense of, I don't know, it's healing, it's soothing, almost in whatever form. But perhaps not when it's, when it's a rushing waterfall. That's a different kind of, that's a sort of invigorating, if you like. That's invigorating. But if it's calmness you want, the River Thames is on slowly and never stops, inshallah.
Do you feel like this idea of healing has been something that is quite talked about, or was it something consciously thought of in garden design throughout Islamic history and even now? The idea of healing.
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think there definitely, I mean, there's a wonderful book about the Prophet and alayhi salam, and the healing plants and the plants of the Quran. In fact, it's interesting, very few plants in a way are mentioned in the Quran. I think it's under 70. They're usually to do with food. So it's because the idea of, I mean, really, I think plants at the beginning were grown for food and for medicinal purposes. So I think healing was a big thing. And when you think of, say, in Turkey, when they built those beautiful mosques, there was always a hospital attached to it, and a garden within the hospital. I'm thinking of the Süleymaniye in Istanbul. There is a garden there. Whether that was there at the beginning, I'm not certain. When they created these big gardens, say from the 16th century, I mean, I'm thinking of the Taj Mahal now, and Mughal gardens, the gardens of Iran. I mean, and also I always go back to the Alhambra, which was earlier, in fact. It's like 12th to 14th century. I haven't looked into it enough from the healing perspective. I think they always knew that there were healing powers because, of course, the Quran talks about it. For every illness, there is a remedy. Look at the way that honey is, the different remedies with honey, and all the herbs, of course, sweet-smelling herbs, and which is rehan, which is usually translated as basil. So I think it was a central part of it, but I have to say I haven't done enough research into that myself. But I think today now more and more we're coming to realise that just on a much more profound level than just the sort of the bodily, as it were, gardens are crucial. They're crucial to our well-being. There's a new book that's come out actually called The Well-Gardened Mind, which is all about the importance of plants for sanity, really. I mean, the person who's involved in it is creating a garden particularly for people with mental illness. The Victorians knew this, actually, in their what they called lunatic asylums. They always had gardens to help heal those who were mentally ill. And of course, there's one I usually say I don't know if it's final, because I'm not sure if I've mentioned every single element, but in the Quran it clearly says there's one word spoken in paradise. You know that word, Amina. It's salam, it's peace. And we all want peace. We want peace not just outside, but more importantly, we want peace from our own preoccupations and our own worries and anxieties, which have been come to the fore, really, because we're not allowed out very much.
Emma, I was going to ask you if you could tell us a little bit about your own journey into how you got involved with garden design and what drew you to the study of Islamic gardens.
Oh, Lord. Well, I was very lucky, and I think completely providentially, I went to study under Professor Keith Critchlow, who very passed away very recently, Alea Khamu. I was at the Royal College of Art, 1988 to 1990, and he was teaching under it was called the Visual Islamic and Traditional Art School, and I really had no idea what I was doing. But he introduced me to Islamic art, the geometry for which he's famous. And for some reason, I wrote my MA thesis on the symbolism of the Islamic garden and garden carpet. So I think it was just being in that environment, being opened up to something I'd never come into contact before, really, which was that art has meaning. Art is beautiful because it has meaning. I mean, as Plato is, or Socrates is supposed to have said, although no one seems to be able to find out where he said it, beauty is the splendor of the true. And I think through that, and I started Quran and actually Sayyidah Hussein Nasr's book, Spirituality and Islamic art and spirituality. So these were all huge openings for me at the time. So that was the sort of beginning. And then after leaving there, and then I went back to teach there, of course, it's now become the School of Traditional Arts. I think my whole heritage, my mother's a very good gardener. And so it was because then I entered Islam in 1990. So it was a combination of somehow my very English background with the spirituality of Islam came together in actually making gardens. And that was a great thing, really. That's completely, I have to thank God for that. Alhamdulillah. I mean, for a long time, but I'm not going to, from practical reasons. I didn't want to write more books about it, although eventually I did write a book, as you mentioned. But I wanted to do something practical because you want to make beautiful things. You don't want to keep writing about them. You don't want it all to be abstract theory. I mean, I don't know. I mean, you've done a lot of academic research. You're a true scholar, Amina. I sort of like to get my hands dirty.
I'm so envious because since, our first guest was Dr. Bilal Badat, and then we had another. So one of the key things throughout this series has been bringing someone who works on the theory as well as the practice and showing how these two things are so interrelated that you can't just be a scholar working in the abstract, that it is actually essential to combine some kind of practice and understand how these things are all interrelated. So I'm totally envious of your field of study and wish that I'm dreaming of going back in time and just studying gardens, because you've created such a rich and incredibly beautiful world just to be able to live in this world. And one of the things I wanted to ask you, Emma, just since you drew on it in your own personal story too, was this combination of kind of your English background and your study of Islamic gardens. And I wanted to ask you, is there any kind of link between Islamic gardens and gardens in England or other parts of sort of Western Europe, as we know?
Yes. But I talked about the plan, the similarity being the enclosed fourfold Islamic garden and of the Cambridge and Oxford colleges, and the cloisters of the different cathedrals across Europe. There's the idea of the enclosure, the idea of the fourfold, which is very much of the earth, because 4 is the number of earth. And of course, circle, the sphere is the celestial realm. And quite often you have circular fountains in the middle of the garden. Sometimes I show, if you look at the Kaaba, which of course is practically a cube, and then the circumambulation is a circle. This is heaven and earth meeting. Now, if you look at Sissinghurst, for example, which is a very famous garden in the southeast of England, to Sackville West, there's a wonderful photograph of there's a sort of circle where she has an enclosure of a yew hedge. And next to that, there's a walled enclosure, which is fourfold, and it's a fourfold design. So there's a geometry, because geometry is in Islamic art and in the garden. There's a rigor, if you like, with the geometry, but then there's this very abundant planting. And I think this is true of all the great gardens in England, what are to be the great gardens, like Great Dixter and Sissinghurst. You get this, you get both. And you get both in the Islamic. I mean, look at Relife. There's there's a lot of geometry there, but there's also a lot of planting. I would say there needs to be more planting there, actually. But when you look at old photographs, particularly of the Court of Myrtles and the Court of Lions, now the Court of Lions is like it's a bit of a shadow of its former self, really. It still has incredible beauty, but instead of originally the four quarters had luscious planting in. You had this lovely balance between planting and the architecture. Now, of course, and it's for practical reasons, of course, the damp ruins the architecture. So they've recently put marble everywhere. So the light is too glaring, because light is so important in Islamic architecture, and it's too bright. And I think they've now got a citrus plant in each of the four quarters. But yes, there is this similarity. Just to go, there's a similarity between this balance between rigor and abundance in the planting and in the geometry. And there are many, Sezinco, which is a garden in Gloucestershire, that was actually done inspired by Mughal gardens, because the person who owned it had been in India. That's a slightly different matter. But I think what it does make Islamic gardens stand out in a way is the fact that the intention is to make something which is a reflection of heaven, or to give a taste of heaven, or which is intended to be contemplative. It's there for us to take a deep breath when we go in, and to sit and to just have that time, a little bit of quietness, to remember who we are. And in English gardens are much more practical. We're very practical. The French are the philosophers. The English are they're practical. They just get on with things and they start digging, and they don't think too much. And there's quite a lot of truth in that. But I think a key is, and that's why I think that Islamic gardens might, although people here think, this sounds very alien, we don't want one in our completely different climate. Actually, a lot of the plants that we use they originate not necessarily in the Middle East, but in the Mediterranean. And there's a lot that if you have the principle of design from Islam, and then you have local planting conditions, I think there's a beautiful combination, there's a beautiful harmony there, and they aren't so different. So I think there are similarities, especially if you go back to, your own special subject, Amina, which is Islamic Spain. I think they're the books that I generally look at there. They're all the medicinal, books are from the Muslims from about the 14th and 15th century, aren't they? Or even a little bit earlier. And I quote them in my own book. It's quite interesting. The things that they say from 1400, we would do now. It says something like, grow your climbers on a sunny facing wall. And it's all exactly the same. I've gone a bit off subject.
No, it's perfect. Actually, it leads us exactly to what I wanted to ask next, which is all of this must have connected for you in a very tangible way during your designing of a beautiful garden in the Cambridge Central Mosque project. Can you tell us a little bit about your work there and how you did that designing and what that garden is supposed to be?
Yes, it's a small garden, so it's very kind of you to say it's beautiful. It's just a sort of taste, because it was quite a small plot, and they had to build almost as big a mosque as possible in order to house the worshippers, because there are a lot of Muslims in Cambridge now, and they wanted an eco mosque, and a mosque which would fit in with the surroundings. This is something which I do emphasize again and again with design, is the context is so important. So, but of course, first of all, the idea of having the Islamic, there's a Islamic, what we call the Islamic garden, which is like a Chahar Bagh, which is closest to the atrium of the mosque coming out. And then there are the railings. And then you have what's called the community garden that I mentioned before, with the bus stop just on the pavement, which is really 4 large planting beds. So in those we've put 4 fastigiate betula, fastigiate birch, because there was it's called the community garden because there was a very small garden there which was looked after by the local gardening community, and there used to be a birch, so we wanted to sort of honour that and give them something that they were fond of. But we've chosen the fastigiate form, which is the columnar form, in order to sort of hark back to the Islamic gardens across the Islamic world. I mean, particularly we're in Turkey and actually all over the southern Mediterranean, the cypress tree, which is sometimes a bit tricky growing it in England. So, and in any case, we wanted the birch. So we've got 4 columnar birches there, surrounded by quite mixed Mediterranean planting, a lot of teucrium, which has been fantastic, lovely blue flowers with a slightly little grey leaf, a lot of rosemary. We also wanted to have quite a lot of herbs. And then, and always a sort of mixture between evergreen and perennial and non-evergreen. Suddenly can't remember the name. In any case, the roses, we've got many roses. Roses are extremely important in Islam and in England. And I'm very fussy about roses, and I particularly wanted to have a lot of damask roses. Damask are the old roses, they come from Damascus. In theory, they come from Damascus. The history of the rose is argued about over and over again, but there's no question that some of them do come from Damascus. So we've got Celsiana. We've also got some more contemporary ones which are more disease resistant, but they have the look of the old rose, which is what David Austin's, who's a rose grower, sort of specialises in old roses, which are repeat flowering, and etc. We've also got Celsiana, which is a damask rose. Did I mention that? Trying to think. And then, of course, tulips. I mean, the whole planting was a balance between what grows well in England and which also gives you a taste of the Islamic garden, if you like. I mean, obviously, we're not going to plant date palms. And it's nice to have fruit. So we planted 8 crabapple trees in each of the 8 beds. Because fruit is so important in the Quran. If you read when you read the descriptions, you know, it's supposed to be the paradise garden of delicious things to eat, and the 4 key plants, in fact, are the date palm, the fig, the pomegranate, and the olive, which are none of which are really going to survive at all well in Cambridge, which has a very cold east wind, as you know, and it's very exposed. So we just went for things which would survive and look good, and which are also true to England. We need to have as I say, we need to have this balance, and we've got, as I wanted it to be more enclosed, we had to open up for several sort of practical reasons, like access, health and safety, and access for fire engines and all that kind of thing. So we've got, for our structure, we've used the enclosure of evergreen yew hedges to give a lovely dark green sort of background to the planting. I'm sure I talked about tulips. Again, we've used some cultivated ones, but the species ones which come from Turkey, and I'm mostly, which are the smaller, and then the lily, what are called the lily flowered ones, because if you look in a lot of miniature paintings, you have there are tulips. They're usually these ones with pointed petals, which are called lily flowered tulips. And of course, again, in miniature paintings, you get the cypress tree, dark green, tall cypress tree next to the blossoming fruit. So a yew hedge with the blossom of the crabapple, that's the closest we could get to that. But it looked very pretty a month ago. I'm sure that's over now. I haven't been there 6 weeks or
Is
something.
it a garden that's designed to have a kind of seasonal? Does it have a seasonal bloom, or is it mostly? Is the best time to visit that garden in the summer, or would it have something that you can enjoy at all?
No. As far as possible, we've got something all the way through the seasons. Thank you for reminding me. Yes, I mean we've had tulips and other sort of really, I think, different types of snowdrops. Roses, anemones, hellebores we've had for the early spring. And now we're coming into summer because we're now halfway through May, so the roses are all in bud. We have lots of other perennials apart from the teucrium.
Emma, what was the feel you were going for in this garden? What were you trying to create?
We were trying to create something which gives one a taste, we hope, of the Paradise Garden, but it also reflects contemporary concern for the environment, of course, encouraging pollinators, biodiversity. So you choose plants which are particularly liked by bees and by butterflies. Also the sort of naturalistic look. People think that Islamic gardens can sometimes be very rigid and practically like Victorian bedding, which is, I would argue, is really not the case. I talked about the balance between rigor, and this is what we were going for. So you enter the garden, if you come through the main gate, which is in fact you normally come from the side, but it doesn't matter, you go through the garden from the side, and then in the very center there's the fountain with it's a circular fountain with so the water is ever flowing like the eternal waters of paradise. And within the 8 beds, so there's 4 beds each side, so it's like a small chahara bagh each side of the fountain area where you can walk through or sit on the benches. This is naturalistic, I would say. We really want to give the impression of being not, I mean to say wild, we've got a mixture of roses and perennials and a few grasses, quite tall perennials like baptisia and some salvias, to just to give this sort of naturalistic look, to balance the layout of the geometry, and within the frame of the dark green of the yew hedge, there's colour. There's so I think that's all, it's become more and more important in my work, and the friends I was working with, is just encouraging nature. It sounds a bit that sounds extremely vague. Not going for the highly cultivars. We're going much more for the species flowers, and just to keep that sort of slightly semi-wild look, and sort of flowing look, if you like, when it is very windy there, and it's rather nice to have this gentle breeze. So that's very much part of it. And all around the edge we've got climbers, which most of them will self-cling, and scent. I mean, I talked about scent being an important element. We've chosen, as far as possible, a lot of scented flowers.
Emma, do you think that most of us, well, it's hard to speak for the entirety of the people, but I think a lot of us, certainly myself included, have almost zero to fraction knowledge of this kind of garden planning and how to create this very balanced between the rigor and the beauty, what you were describing, the rigor and the kind of wild. Would you say that, in your estimation, in your work, is this something, have we become disconnected from our knowledge of this heritage? And if so, why do you think that
is? Yes, when you say we, I'm not, I certainly, I think in England we're called the nation of gardeners. So certainly in the country, people are they're not disconnected. Having said that, 85% of people in the UK now live in towns, and yeah, there's a very clear reason why we've become disconnected, and that we don't have gardens. People live in flats. And I mean, in this lockdown, it's absolutely horrendous for people living in high-rise blocks who have nowhere to go, and they can only sort of see it miles away outside their window. And it's a huge, huge privilege to have even a tiny little patch like I've got. So I think those are sort of obvious reasons. And I don't know, when I went to school, I went to school somewhere in the country. So we used to do gardening, which I have to say I wasn't very keen on at the time. But, I was lucky enough to be brought up with a garden. Now, most people are not. So there is disconnection. Thank the Lord, we have fantastic parks here. And I don't know about Tübingen, which is a smaller town, so you can probably get into the country more easily. I think the disconnection is for very obvious reasons. We live in industrial, mechanical, technological society, and children are brought up not to run around outside, but to look on their iPads. I don't know. It's an uphill struggle, but it's hugely important, obviously, and it's contributed to mental illness, I would imagine. I mean, I don't know if there are statistics for this, but they keep saying how important it is to have a garden for mental well-being, and there is really no question about that. I mean, in a way, it's been said a lot, but it deserves constant repetition. Also, I think one has to remember to you look at the garden, and you look at flowers, you go into the park, you feel a sort of sense of relief in a way, and a sense of release, because you can just lie down on the grass and look up through the trees. But also, we have to remind ourselves that it is beautiful, but what is it? Why is it that nature does give us this great solace? And I think that's what we've forgotten as well. Certainly in this country, quite a lot. We do love the gardens, we love nature, but why do we love it so much? And there is, if one can open one's heart and mind, nature is a book. It's a book of symbols. It's a sacred text. Everything speaks to us if we understood that every leaf was a symbol of our creator, of the divine. I mean, it's easy for us, you and I, and probably most people who look at these Ramadan events, they're probably practitioners of a faith, and probably Islam, so it's an easy thing to believe. But most of my family are probably agnostic, and they love nature. But to actually acknowledge the fact that there is a divinity behind this nature, that's a whole other step. And this is something that Sayyidah Zainab has talked about a lot. I might even have a quotation. Daydreaming, if we think we can solve the problems of the environment through social and physical dimensions only. He says there'll be no long-lasting results unless we also pay attention to the spiritual environment and to our own spiritual natures. And I think that really is key for now, and for for any future that we may have in this world, God willing, inshallah. They talk about sustainability all the time. Who is the great sustainer?
What do you think you can do to promote more gardens in our mosques, especially in Britain and other parts of Europe and North America?
Well, that's interesting too, because you'll find some people, historians, saying that gardens have got really nothing to do with traditional mosques. And actually, you've probably travelled a lot yourself. You don't normally associate gardens necessarily with mosques. I think Turkey is probably one of the few places where, if you go and visit the mosque, say in Istanbul and elsewhere, where they have a kind of garden outside, and then mausoleums do, like in Konya. It's a lovely garden surrounding Rumi's tomb there. And of course, these great mausoleums in Mughal India, there's a garden attached. What can we do to encourage it? I think you have to educate those who are building the mosques. There's the whole thing about patrons. Patrons in the past will somehow seem to have slightly better idea of what is truly beautiful, if I might make such a generalized statement. So anyone who's built, there are thousands of mosques apparently in the UK, but not one of them, well, I better be careful here. People, they don't have money. They build, it's kind of press button architecture, and there's no space. What can we do? You need a lot of money, I'm afraid. I mean, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry to say that. But, Tim Winter, Abdul Hakim Murad, has done an incredible job at Cambridge, and he raised the funds, and he made sure at least that there was a space for a small garden at the front. And I think it's been a huge, I'm not saying the garden's been a success, but the whole venture has been a great success, because he knows about the history of traditional Islamic art and architecture, and he knows the importance also of the garden. So therefore, if you've got one person leading it who knows about this, then that's going to have a huge input on the whole construction and the whole achievement at the end. So I think if more and more people could be model themselves on him, or just on an understanding and knowledge of what it really means to have this beauty, the importance of it. It's not something superficial. You find some people say, well, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter at all. We just need to put this up and have as much space as possible. So I think education, Amina, is that what educating the patron, which is what the Cambridge Muslim College is all about, in fact. It's educating Muslims particularly, isn't it, about their own culture. And that's hugely important.
If we could step even back out of Cambridge a bit more, and just if I could ask you about the kind of recent maybe discovery is too vague, but the kind of recent interest in plants and trees in particular as having been increasingly shown to have extraordinarily complex and emotional centers, as well as kind of social networks between them. And without, confusing ourselves with the science of it all, do you get a sense that this is a case in your work with plants? Have you gotten a sense that there is an extraordinary world all around us that if we just listen, we might hear something special?
Yes, that's beautifully put. Well, I'm keep looking towards the garden, thinking which ones do I speak to the most of the plants. I think, you've experienced this, and probably most people who listen to this will know how much it sort of calms your emotions, if you like, just being with trees. And let's talk about trees in particular. I showed this book before to you, and this talks about the hidden life of trees and the social networks and how they look after each other through their roots, and the fungi, the importance of fungi, of course. I don't know a lot about it myself. I just know from an intuitive and from a sort of maybe a spiritual and an emotional, my own personal experience of feeling at peace when I go for long walks. And that's probably what I'm missing most now in my small flat in West London, is not having the wide open spaces. It becomes a real longing, that the wide open space and just nature which hasn't been sort of tamed, if you like. So there are many levels, and I think there's an awful lot we don't know, and there are many people doing research on this, on the interaction between trees themselves, just the whole interconnectedness. The central message of the Quran is divine unity. We are part of nature, or we are nature.
So Emma, as a way of kind of concluding our conversation, maybe if you wouldn't mind telling us, and I know this is an impossible question for somebody in this field, but can you tell us maybe what is your or even just today, what is your favorite Islamic garden that you've ever been in and traveled to? What is the one that really speaks to you and stands out to you that you would think this is among my top favorites?
Oh no, that's very easy for me. It's the Henralifa, the Alhambra and Henralifa, and I've been really privileged because I've been there many, many times. I mean, really, very, very lucky. I've been with this a lot on school field trips, but I've also been, just with friends as well, because there is something very, very sort of rather magical about it, and it takes you. Especially if you've managed to get there. Even not that long ago, I managed to get in very early in the morning and there was nobody. It's always crowded, but we were right at the front. And because I'd already been in a few times, I knew what I wanted to do. And I just sort of rushed in and you got there in the silence. And it was just extraordinary to be in the Court of Myrtles and the Court of Lions with nobody there except a few guards. And then you got a taste of what it must have been like. And the experience, because it's on this beautiful human scale, and in spite of these 6,000 people a day who go through there, there is a presence, and it's a divine presence because it was made according to certain principles. It was made by people who did understand what they were doing, really. So, if anyone, I mean, obviously, no one can visit at the moment, but. I would like to go, but I'd like to do some planting there because I think their planting could do with a little bit of improvement. But it's a beautiful combination of water. They've got the exact right flow of water, which is very important. It's supposed to murmur the water when it comes out of the fountain, and it murmurs. It's got so many beautiful fountains there and rills and.
Thank you, Emma.
I'm going to probably name any others.
Oh, Emma, you have given us such a comprehensive overview of Islamic gardens and brought up so many helpful ways of connecting past and present. You've shown us how the Quranic imagery of the garden is at the heart of garden design in Muslim history. And while clear principles of design appear to be uniform across the Muslim world, they manifest in infinitely varied ways. And this reiterates a key point that's come up throughout this series about the unfolding of the Islamic tradition across all spheres and the continual interplay of unity and diversity. I'm also so grateful to you for reminding us how much we lose when we pigeonhole Islamic gardens into a study of ornament and architecture as opposed to an integral feature of the vivid and vibrant ways in which Muslims imbued meaning and signposts to the divine in their built world. And what you've shown us, the garden is not adjunct or superfluous, but at the heart of Muslim habitation of spaces. And appreciating this can nourish our current building projects with a much deeper understanding of the role of gardens in Muslim public and private spaces. And most importantly, you've created such a vivid image of gardens that we are so thankful to you, especially as we approach these last days and nights in this most sacred month, for reminding us that even if we don't have a garden in which to sit, we can surely find a garden within in which to ponder, reflect, and contemplate upon the glories of the Creator. So Emma, I thank you so much for your time and your insight.
That was a brilliant summing up, Amina. Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure and a great honour to participate in these. I hope everyone manages to get out into a park or some kind of garden for these last few days of Ramadan. Actually 2 weeks.
Oh, I hope so. Truly, that would be a wonderful gift for us all. So that concludes our program this Ramadan. And as we part, I want to encourage you to please donate generously to the Cambridge Muslim College to help the college carry on with its tremendous work. I'm also grateful to the college for the opportunity to participate and benefit from so many of the wonderful talks and lectures this Ramadan. And a special thanks to Zainab Kaba for her organizing, and Tariq Chaudhry, the media and digital officer of the college, for all the editorial work and background ensuring that everything runs so smoothly. And finally, I want to extend my heartfelt thanks to all of you who tuned in for these Saturday evening sessions. I wish you all health and peace and beautiful last days of Ramadan and joyful days of Eid, and of course, eternal gardens underneath which rivers flow. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.